So I think we'll begin. It's an enormous privilege for me to introduce Dr. Ramachandra Guha, who really needs no introduction, but I will nonetheless give him a brief introduction. Dr. Guha is a historian and a biographer based in Bangalore. He is a full-time writer, but he's taught at Yale, Stanford, Oslo, Berkeley, and most recently the LSE. For this week, he's been a distinguished global visitor at the Hauser Global Law School program at the NYU School of Law, and we're very grateful that he took time out of his busy schedule to come and be with us in New York City. Dr. Guha is the author of many important works. He began his intellectual career as an environmental historian, and his first book, The Unquiet Woods, was a prize-winning book published by the University of California Press, and then as well, he wrote a very important social history of cricket, a corner of a foreign field. And as those of you who follow cricket might know, Dr. Guha is known in India as a leading commentator on cricket, perhaps more than he is a commentator on current affairs, which says quite a bit, given how prominent a political commentator he is in India. Many of you would know, of course, Dr. Guha's famous book, India After Gandhi, The History of the World's Largest Democracy, which was an international sensation when it came out and is widely regarded as the definitive history of post-independence India. It's panoramic in scope, it's compulsively readable, and I urge you all to read it if you haven't. It's won many prizes, and Dr. Guha has since then published another book, Makers of Modern India, which is an anthology of political thought, co-published by Penguin India and HUP. And he has recently completed a biography of Gandhi, including focusing on Gandhi's years in South Africa, which is a completely neglected area of his life that, again, will attract a wide international readership. So let me explain what the premise of this panel. And so when we were chatting with Ram about what he might do at NYU for his week with us, I immediately was proposed that he give a talk based on a very provocative piece he published in 2008 that was entitled, "Will India Become a Superpower?" Question mark. It's a question. And so the piece was motivated by a certain type of political discourse which suggested that at the turn of the century, not only had India survived, it had been successful, and so the next question was, how great a power would India be on the global stage? And so I suggested to Ram that he give a talk with the same title, and he refused. And so what we have instead is this title, India's Internal Fault Lines, a fatal blow to its global ambition. So I said to him, why won't you just use the same title as you did for your rightly renowned piece? And he said, well, the title of that first piece is a bit too optimistic because it poses the question, as if it could be answered in the affirmative. But I wanted to give a title that's a bit more realistic now. And so that hence we have the one that we came up with. So with that introduction, it's a great pleasure for me to turn it over to Dr. Ram Guha.
Thank you, Sujit. Thank you all for coming here. The piece that Sujit mentioned, which I published 4 years ago, with the title, Will India Be a Superpower? It was issued as a booklet by Outlook magazine. And I originally wanted to call it, Sujit, 7 Reasons Why India Will Not and Should Not Be a Superpower. and the magazine said that's too pessimistic. So just say, will India be a superpower, question mark. But now, 4 years later, what seemed unrealistic is now so fantastical that I will not even, that's why I insisted that the superpower, that term could not figure in our title. India may or may not become a superpower, but it remains, in my view, the most recklessly ambitious political experiment in human history. And that's making a recklessly ambitious claim in this country, which sometimes has been argued, with some plausibility is rather reckless and ambitious as a political experiment. But why do I assign India that sort of privileged status? And it's because I consider India to be both the world's most unnatural nation and its least likely democracy. The world's most unnatural nation because of its extraordinary diversity of religion, language, ecologies, cuisines, cultures, ways of dress, more diverse than any other country in the world and on such a large geographical scale and demographic scale. And at the same time, the world's least likely democracy because never before in human history was the vote granted to a largely illiterate population, and never before in human history was universal adult franchise decided upon so soon after a nation's independence. India becomes independent in 1947. In 1950, the Constitution of India is sort of formalized. In 1952, the first elections are held, with 65% of the voters being illiterate. At a time when, of course, in Switzerland, for example, women did not have the vote. Indian women had the vote before Switzerland, and at a time when in this country large numbers of course, African Americans were effectively disenfranchised. So, and because of this, those elections were called the biggest gamble in history, because it was thought that how can you have a democracy in a country that is largely illiterate? How can you have a nation in a country that's so diverse? And the uniqueness of the Indian political experiment was captured has been talked about by many people, but at least in the research I've done, I've not come across a more evocative and sharper description of the distinctiveness of this experiment than in some letters I found in the National Library of Scotland. So I'm going to begin with those letters. These letters were written by a great biologist named J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the great scientists of the 20th century. I'm sure very well known in this university and other universities in the science departments. But what is less well known about his career is that at the age of 60, in 1956, after having held chairs in Oxford, Cambridge, and University College London, and having pioneered the study of mathematical biology, genetics, and several other fields, Haldane decided to move to India in a radical departure from the common practice of bright young Eastern scientists moving west in search of fame and fortune. You had an established great Western scientist at the age of 60 moving to India. And he was asked while he was moving why he took this rather strange, peculiar decision. And Haldane was a brilliant and eccentric man, as will come out from the letters I'm going to read. But when he was asked, why are you leaving this comfortable perch in British academic life to go to an uncertain life in a young and struggling nation, he gave various answers. This is 1956. So at one stage he said, this was just after the Suez fiasco, he said, I do not want to live in an imperialist country. At another stage he said, the Prime Minister of India, namely Jawaharlal Nehru, is a rather more intelligent and attractive man than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Anthony Eden, undoubtedly correct. And then on a third occasion he said, when asked why he was moving to India, Haldane replied, 60 years in socks was enough. So he moves to India in 1956, and since it's such a prestigious catch for the Indian government, his application for Indian citizenship is fast-tracked. And he gets that citizenship in a mere matter of 12 months. An esteemed colleague of mine, the Belgian-born economist Jean Drèze, whose work many of you know, took 15 years to get Indian citizenship. It was granted to him recently. But Haldane, Jawaharlal Nehru, recognizing the kind of the cachet and the propaganda value of this, gives him Indian citizenship. He becomes a professor in the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, starts a genetics unit, and 3 years after he moves to India, is the subject of a profile in an American science magazine, where the journalist writing the profile describes Haldane as a citizen of the world. Now, that's a kind of label that some of us would proudly avow. But Haldane, being the kind of eccentric Scottish, English, Indian he is, writes an angry letter to this journalist and says, "No doubt I am in some sense a citizen of the world." But then he continues, "But I believe, with Thomas Jefferson, that one of the chief duties of a citizen is to be a nuisance to the government of his state. As there is no world state, I cannot do this. On the other hand, I can be and am a nuisance to the government of India, which has the merit of permitting a good deal of criticism, although it reacts to it rather slowly." Now, that's certainly my experience. But Haldane continues. He says, "I also happen to be proud of being a citizen of India, which is a lot more diverse than Europe, let alone the USA, USSR, or China, and thus a better model for a possible world organization. It may, of course, break up, but it is a wonderful experiment. So I want to be labeled a citizen of India rather than a citizen of the world." Now, Haldane's quote, I think, captures the kind of uniqueness and the scale and the ambition of the Indian political experiment. And because India is an unnatural nation and an unlikely democracy, its political ride was destined to be one full of hurdles and rocks. It was not going to be smooth. This is not a small, homogeneous country where everyone speaks the same language, subscribes to the same faith, which has a highly educated citizenry, which has well-developed public institutions and universities and hospitals and so on. So we were always destined to have a rocky and tumultuous ride. And so, indeed, it has been. If you look at our history as an independent nation, and you look at it decade by decade, every decade has seen major conflicts in different parts of the country along different axes. And I'd just like to recapitulate for you the major conflicts decade by decade that the Republic of India has faced before coming to the fault lines and the challenges we face in the current decade. So we get our independence in August 1947. Less than 6 months later, Mohandas K. Gandhi, the father of the nation, is shot dead by a right-wing Hindu fundamentalist. Now, this episode is famously well known. But what is much less well known is that 6 weeks after Gandhi was assassinated, the Communist Party of India met in a secret conclave in Calcutta and declared war on the Indian state. Of course, partly inspired by what was happening in China and partly under orders from Stalin's Russia. The communists launched an insurrection in different parts of India. So at its birth, the Republic of India, or not then a republic, the independent dominion of India, was faced with the challenge from right-wing Hindu fundamentalism and left-wing communist extremism. And it's a long and complicated story as to how that challenge was contained, tamed. Both sets of extremists were brought into the democratic system, a constitution was forged, and in the first election of 1952, the communists and the Hindu right-wing party, the Jansangh, both fought, sort of using the ballot rather than the bullet. So at its birth, in the late 1940s, you had left-wing and right-wing extremism. Move to the 1950s, and this is a decade, for the student of social conflict, it's a decade known above all for the assertion of linguistic-based regional movements, demanding that the map of India be reconstituted across linguistic lines so that rather than follow the territorial boundaries that the British had imposed on India, where, for example, the Bombay Presidency, which extended through large parts of the West, had Marathi speakers, Gujarati speakers, Telugu speakers, Kannada speakers, each of these different linguistic groups, each of which, of course, had a separate script, claim their own distinctive linguistic state. And this is a movement that was, each of these linguistic communities launched massive protests. There were strikes, there were demonstrations, there were shootings, there were burnings, there were hunger strikes, there were fasts. And it was a time of some considerable anguish for a country that was less than a decade old, because in 1947 it had been partitioned on the basis of religion. with the creation of the Muslim homeland of Pakistan. And there were very real fears, at least among the elite, among the intellectual and political elite, that giving in to the demand to linguistic states would lead to a further balkanization of India. As it has turned out, actually, the creation of linguistic states has, in some ways, deepened and furthered Indian unity. But there was this massive upsurge of language-based popular protest movements in the 1950s. Also in the late 40s and 1950s, you had the birth of insurgencies in Kashmir in the west and Nagaland in the east. Now, the Kashmir insurgency is very well known. It's linked to a border dispute between India and Pakistan, the fact that the princely state of Kashmir was claimed by both countries. And, it's a story, at least the broad contours are known to everyone in this audience, including those who are not Indian or specialists for India. But the Naga insurgency is much less known, but it was very serious. In military terms, the Nagas, who are a collection of tribes on the northeast, decided, large numbers of Nagas decided that they did not want to be part of the Indian Union. They held talks with the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru said, you cannot become an independent state, but we can certainly find ways of granting your territories cultural, legal, institutional autonomy. But the Nagas were really determined to have a nation of their own, were fired by that dream. And through the 1950s, there was massive conflict between the Naga rebels and the Indian army, in which many people perished on both sides, and including, of course, villagers who were caught in the crossfire. And it was done completely out of reach of, very far away from New Delhi, so out of reach not only of the foreign media, but also of the Indian media. So the Naga insurgency, which dates back to the early 1950s, is really very little known outside India, but has posed a major challenge to the territorial unity of the Indian state. So that's the 1950s. Come to the 1960s, and the Naga insurgency is joined by an insurgency in another northeastern state led by the Mizos, who are another group of tribal communities ethnically, religiously, linguistically, quite distinct from mainland Indic civilization. They also started insurgency for an independent nation state of Mizoram, an insurgency that again provokes perhaps an excessive reaction from the Indian state, even the use of of air force in 1965. So then you have also in the 1960s the rebirth of revolutionary communism. Inspired by Chairman Mao, you have a party, the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, known popularly as the Naxalites, after a village in northern Bengal where they started their first armed struggle. You have in different parts of India movements for the capture of state power by left-wing communist rebels. And also in the 1960s, you face mass scarcity. It's a failure of successive droughts. India being saved really only through massive food aid from Canada, from the US, from Australia, and from the Soviet Union. The 1970s are also a time of instability. There's a time of a major popular movement against corruption and authoritarian rule, which provokes the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to arrest all her political opponents, to suspend civil liberties, to effectively abandon democratic procedure and run the country as an authoritarian single party, indeed single family system, because her younger son Sanjay Gandhi becomes more or less an extra constitutional source of political power and influence. Move on to the 1980s, you have a movement for separate nationhood in Assam, which is another major eastern state, much more heavily populated, along the Brahmaputra River. You also have the rise of an insurgency in the Sikh-dominated state of Punjab, violent, bloody, provoking religious conflict, the storming of the major Sikh shrine, the Golden Temple, by the Indian Army, in turn provoking the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, in turn provoking a pogrom against innocent Sikhs in Delhi and across northern India. Come to the 1990s, you have the rise of the Kashmir insurgency as a real popular movement for azadi or freedom. You have disputes over caste and affirmative action, caste riots across northern India, And above all, you have the polarizing of Hindu-Muslim relations sparked by a dispute in the town of Ayodhya, where a mosque was believed to have been built on the shrine, on a temple devoted to the Hindu god Ram. Come to the 2000s, and you have continuing trouble in Kashmir, you have a major pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat, and you have Islamic fundamentalism having an impact on India, especially as you know in the attack on Bombay in 2008. So the point of listing all of this is to refresh our minds and to think as from the perspective of a historian. Conflict, disruption, insurgency, violence, tension, social conflict are nothing new. Indian history has been, in the history of India as an independent nation, has been punctuated by conflict and rebellion. Over time, some of these problems have been resolved. The two most successful insurgencies that have been tamed are the Mizoram and the Punjab insurgency. Mizoram and Punjab are states where once the army ruled, but now you have peaceful elections where the populations of these states are able to send their representatives to democratically elected legislatures. The linguistic state problem solved in many ways the tensions between the centre and the state, deepened federalism. But just as old conflicts have been resolved or tamed or contained within a democratic framework, new forms of conflict around different axes have surfaced or intensified. And if you think of India today, in 2012, and if I was to list what are the major political, social, institutional challenges that India faces today, what are India's internal fault lines, I would list 4 above all. There could be more, but I'm going to list 4. The first fault line is to do with continuing conflicts over identity, linguistic, caste, and religious identity. At the moment, these seem moderate and manageable, but these could escalate. In 2002, I mentioned that there were these pogroms against Muslims in Gujarat, which were really a shocking episode in the history of independent India, where the state government of Gujarat looked on and in some cases actively aided rioters who had targeted vulnerable minority communities. And in the decades since the Gujarat riots, there hasn't been a serious Hindu-Muslim riot. There was an episode in Assam a couple of months ago that was quite serious. And on the whole, as someone who travels around India and interacts with a wide variety of people, I would say that one can be cautiously positive on this front, that at both sides of the religious divide, the Hindu side and the Islamic side, tempers have cooled. You know, the middle ground is now more capacious. The violent extremists are less capable of mobilizing or inflaming popular passions towards sectarian or violent ends. But it's a fragile peace. The religious peace in India today is a fragile peace. And it could be disturbed by terror attack from outside. It could be disturbed by scarcity within. The second major fault line facing India today is to do with secessionist movements in 3 border states, Kashmir, Nagaland, and Manipur. Now, India is a union of 28 states. 25 of these 28 states are at peace with the idea of a united and plural India. They do not want separate nationhood. India is also a relatively young experiment. Speaking in this country, and as a historian, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that India is 65 years old, and 90 years after American independence, a very bloody and brutal and costly civil war was fought in this country over the question of national unity. Now, in fact, just yesterday I was walking through Central Park and I came across some statues. I hadn't had a long walk through Central Park for a long time, and I came across some statues in memory of those who fought for the Union. I mean, so the Union of the United States, national unity, was achieved over a very long period. Likewise in France or Britain or Spain. And from a historian's point of view, clearly one can be detached and say, we are 65 years young, that 3 states are, unreconciled is actually quite good going. If 25 out of 28 are okay with union, and those 3 states are small demographically, but we live at different times. We live in the 21st century, where the scrutiny of the world is upon us, where expectations of human rights are much higher, where states are supposed to behave much more responsibly, and so on and so forth. So the fact that in 3 states in India, Nagaland, Manipur, and in Kashmir, large sections of the population desire separation from India is a matter that must, compel some serious attention. So that's the second fault line. The third fault line is a growing Maoist insurgency in the heart of India, which is a manifestation of deep and pervasive inequalities in Indian society, and particularly in the distribution of the gains of economic liberalization and economic development. The Maoists are particularly strong among tribal communities in central India that have faced a series of, one could say they faced serial dispossession. Tribals across the central Indian heartland have had the misfortune to live along India's fastest flowing rivers, amidst India's most valuable forests, and on top of India's most lucrative, commercially lucrative mineral resources. So they felt serial dispossession at the hands of dam builders, commercial logging companies, and most recently, mining companies, and have been deprived, disadvantaged, dispossessed, and have not found the stake, honorable and proper, dignified stake in the democratic political system. And this is kind of an open invitation for Maoist insurgents to root themselves in these tribal people who live in hill and forest areas, which are also, of course, from a geographical point of view, very well suited to guerrilla warfare. So geographically, sociologically, ecologically, and economically, there are various reasons why this has become a kind of theater for insurrection. The areas occupied or controlled by Maoists, the estimates vary. Over the last 10 or 12 years, there's been a kind of regular bursts of violence. So the Maoists attack a police station, an armory, kill 20, 30 constables, kill 20, 30 soldiers. The paramilitary or the police retaliate, burn villages, subjected of harboring Maoists and so on. And every few months there are these episodes of violence, and there's no sign that it will disappear. It's like geographically contained. It's very unlikely that the Maoists can expand their military or even moral influence outside these hill and forest areas. At the same time, the state has lost its credibility and its legitimacy among the communities where the Maoists are active. So India is a very large country. So, it can, in a sense, absorb this violence. It can continue, the functioning of the country as a whole, or of the economy as a whole can continue. But a massive human cost within those districts and hills and valleys where the conflict is being played out. So that's challenge number 3. And challenge number 4 is to do with the abuse of our natural environment. There's some debate in the Indian press about climate change and India's responsibilities towards forging a more equitable, sustainable climate change regime. But I think one should focus somewhat more on domestic environmental problems, on the massive environmental degradation within India. India is an environmental basket case. Rates of air pollution in India are higher than almost anywhere else. Delhi, Calcutta, Bangalore, Bombay are among the most polluted cities in the world. Historically, most Indian cities were sited on rivers, which are a source of drinking water, irrigation. These rivers are dead, biologically dead. Much of Indian agriculture depends on groundwater aquifers, which are being depleted by the day. They are declining very rapidly. There's chemical contamination of the soil. There's a decimation of biodiversity, and so on and so forth. And this environmental crisis, air and water pollution, deforestation, depletion of water resources, the decimation of fish stocks in river and ocean, leads to conflicts between different groups of resource users. In my home state, Karnataka, as we meet here today, there's a major conflict brewing between Karnataka, which is an upstream state on the river Kaveri, and Tamil Nadu, which is downstream. the rains have failed, and the water sharing agreement mandated by the Supreme Court is not being adhered to by my state because it's upstream and it says we are not going to release water downstream. Now, this is going to lead to retributive conflict, violence, strikes, and this is kind of, this has its roots in the mismanagement of our natural resources. So, you have really several major internal fault lines. I've just listed 4. Conflicts over caste and religious identity, secessionist movements, a Maoist insurgency, and massive and widespread environmental degradation. Now, how does one overcome these challenges? In my view, to tackle the problems identified above, inequality, insurgency, environmental degradation, the principal agency must be the state. You know, the market is good at generating economic growth quickly and efficiently. It's not very good at distributing it equitably, and it's even worse at managing the environmental consequences of rapid economic growth. In fact, as classical economic theory tells you, it's completely rational for a private company to externalize costs by polluting a river or the atmosphere or whatever else. So, to provide equality of opportunity by nurturing good schools and hospitals and infrastructural facilities so that every citizen has an equal chance of participating in the benefits of a growing economy, the state must really get its act together. To assure the sustainable management of water, air, forests, again, the principal agency must be the state. To bring about social peace between Hindus and Muslims, to reconcile the unreconciled parts of India, that is to convince the Kashmiris, the Manipuris, the Nagas, that the Indian constitution is flexible and enough to accommodate different interests within a unitary structure. It must be really the state that should play the principal part. Now, one of the paradoxes of Indian democracy really is that Indian national unity in the 40s and 50s and the foundations of a democratic infrastructure through the Indian Constitution, the Electoral Commission and other such agencies was really the handiwork of a visionary group of politicians and administrators. And you see the steady corruption and corrosion of public systems in India. There have been some recent debates about massive corruption where millions of dollars have been appropriated by politicians by handing out licenses for raw materials or spectrum to favored capitalists. But there's also the problem of everyday corruption faced by citizens. There's the decline of efficiency of public institutions, so that you have public schools where teachers don't attend work. You have public hospitals where doctors and nurses never show up. And the burden of all of this is principally faced by the poor and the vulnerable, because the middle class can secede from the state system. They can go to private schools, private hospitals. And this really is it is, in a sense, the decline and degradation of public institutions, growing corruption, inefficiencies, incapacities of all kinds of public institutions is a major challenge facing Indian democracy today. Now, that subject of my talk was India's internal fault lines, a fatal blow to its global ambitions, ? And I've talked really about the origins of these fault lines, their articulation, their consequences, and so on, and their social impacts. I'll just say a little bit on bringing the global ambitions point of view. Now, what should be India's global ambitions? Now, I'm not an isolationist. I believe that India must play a role in international affairs. I believe, for example, and since I'm speaking in New York, I should say this, I believe that India has a moral, demographic, historical, political right to be a permanent member of the Security Council. A right far stronger than any other country in the world that is not so far a member. Last year when I was teaching at the LSE, I said this, that there clearly has to be, I said, on all counts, moral, historical, institutional, legal, there has to be a reconstitution of the Security Council. Some members have to go, and France and Britain have to go first. You could have perhaps, and some members have to come, and India has to come first. Perhaps Brazil, perhaps South Africa, perhaps Japan. But so in that sense, I believe that India must become a member of the Security Council. It must play an important role in international disputes, in peacekeeping, in conflict resolution. There was I was talking to Professor Choudhry before, that there was a very interesting initiative several years ago, which hasn't really taken off, where you have a kind of alliance between India, Brazil, and South Africa, which are the three functioning democracies in the southern world. Multicultural functioning democracies. So Brazil is the most important democratic country in Latin America, South Africa in Africa, and India in Asia, if you leave out Japan, which is very, economically at a very different level. And I think these are ways in which Indians can act on the international stage, build bridges with other plural, multicultural democracies in the developing world, have a more of an impact in the UN and so on. But so I'm not an isolationist, but nor am I a triumphalist. The piece that I wrote 4 years ago, which Professor Choudhry mentioned, was really provoked by a kind of sense of arrogance and triumphalism among sections of the Indian elite. That because we were the largest democracy in the world and had successfully held 15 general elections. Every time there's a general election in India, it's the largest exercise of the democratic franchise in human history, because we are so many. So 300 million, 350 million, 400 million people voting. So because of our record as a successful electoral democracy, because of rapid rates of economic growth, there was a sense, and sometimes there still is a sense, among sections of the Indian elite, that India is destined to be a superpower. And it's true, and three sections of the elite lead it: the business elite, the political elite, and the media elite. And I was in a sense responding, of course, to the last, because I write a column, and the media, of course, there are complicated reasons why the business elite and the political elite want talk this kind of superpower talk, and the media elite's reasons, I think, are to do with a deep psychological inferiority versus the media elite of the West. Indian editors would like to occupy the role in the World Economic Forum at Davos, currently played by the editor of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the London Times, and so on. And so they kind of boost this kind of triumphalism. And I think that's completely crazy. What I've tried to do in my talk today, and what I've tried to do in stuff I've written in the Indian press, is to provide a reality check, to focus a sharp glare on these domestic fault lines, and to suggest that because the Indian democratic experiment is so young, it's so reckless, it's so ambitious, we should not really take Indian national unity, Indian democracy, or Indian pluralism for granted. These are all hard-won. These all have to be carefully nurtured, and these all have to be consolidated and deepened, a process which may take several decades. And at this particular juncture of our history as an independent and relatively youthful republic, it's entirely premature to speak of any kind of superpower ambition. Thank you.
So at this point of the program, we'll open the floor to questions. And so Dr. Guha is available for questions. Who would like to pose our first question?
Being an old friend of Ram's and rushing to the front of the bus, first of all to say, Ram, as someone who still deals in somewhat small or confined areas of the study of India, though I've varied them over time, it's really amazing to see your capacity to digest, a very long story, and a story about which the monographic fine points as well as anybody, but to be able to tell, a credible and powerful story over these last 60 years is remarkable, and so I want to congratulate you for that, and thank you for it. To say it's great to hear such a vigorous account of these issues. I have three things to say. I'll say them quickly, because I know others will want to also address the things you made. Two are kind of internal to your argument and in a broad spirit of sympathy to it. The third is not unsympathetic, but somehow slightly outside. So the first two are one more specific, one more general. The more specific one is, you rightly said that these are 4 big foreign. I totally agree with you that the list could be longer. But I also think it should be a list of 20 or 30, because then it becomes a micro policy debate about thousands of things. I think it's the Dalit issue, which is so deep, so old, so transcontinental, so enduring, and so live, and so apparently as yet unresolved. So it would be my candidate for a 5th anyway. So that's one just friendly amendment proposal. The second one is to agree with you and to say that my own reflections, particularly on the kind of commentatoriate about the new India, economic growth, which is always tied up with China, usually, both in those places and here. My recent reflection, which is entirely in sympathy with your analysis, but also brings China in, is to say that both these societies, for all their differences, some obvious, some less so, and their similarities, some obvious, some less so, have shown themselves to be expert in the wealth generation game and terrible at the redistribution game. So I think these are very important things, because we really have what the Indian and Chinese experiments, to use your language experiments, show is that in today's world you can become fabulous at wealth generation and be hopeless at redistribution. And this is in 2 very different qualities. So it's worth pausing over why 2 end in the same place, whether it's 8% or 10%, and where the problems are the same. You can, I think, I'd be interested to hear your view, whether my characterization is correct, and I think it's very much in line with what you're saying about India, but I think we can throw China in there too. Maybe other places as well, but we'll talk about those. So these are my 2 sort of friendly additions to what you're saying. My more not critical but outside your frame argument, which I think, I hope, is relevant to the group that is hosting you, to the question of constitution, nation building, and so on, is to ask a bigger question that while I agree with you that all these challenges exist, there's a presumption in your overall argument, whose source also will be familiar to you, which is about the nation form and the nation state form. I've come a long way since my own views of 20 years ago that this is probably likely a going thing, although I still think it was well worth repeating that the nation state form is a 400-year-old form. Nobody called from heaven saying it is determined to be here forever. And it's perfectly fine to ask about its history, its fragility worldwide. But I go back to it in this way, that if you look at the period before Indian independence, one could well look at everything you've said, and that what it signals is a question: who named the national project? Now, who named the project of the nation state? Who defined the territory? Who defined unity? Who defined belonging, etc., and for whom? You could ask that about every single social case, every region, border or central. You didn't mention South India, where for a very long period people wanted out.
Yeah. The Tamil border.
They don't want part of Delhi, they don't want part of Hindi. That's gone now, but those are good reasons for it, as you said.
Yeah.
So the big question is, we have a constitutional project, we have a democratic project, but we also have a national project. None of them were awarded by heaven as something which is India's destiny, unless one simply buys straight into some version that says India was a nation, starting in Mohenjo-daro, which is plainly untrue. India was a nation starting in 47, not even in 40 or in 1850. It began then. So my invitation to you and my request to you, my suggestion to you is, how would the terms change of your account, all of which I totally agree with, both in spirit and content, if we said that these fragilities, and we're not talking about comparatively, US has its fragility, I think none of these nations are born in heaven.
Yeah.
France, here, there, the whole European Islamic link is because there's a Islamic history of thousands of years before the last 100. That is why Islam is still around in Europe, not because it arrived by plane from Saudi Arabia. So I'm not from the others, but India, since that is our case, I'm asking whether the challenge of the democratic project, for which I have great admiration internally, for the electoral project, which you say is the greatest logistic achievement in
Yeah.
human history,
Yeah.
etc. But that's within that frame. But if you go outside that frame and say, what is all this about? I think it's very important to say it is about a project which itself, as it were, somehow arrived without massive sign-on from large populations, geographical, caste, religious, etc. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that these problems endure, that they appear in this form, that form, etc. Because, and so the broader comparative question is the relation between nation, constitution, democracy. Sorry to have gone on this topic.
No.
It's the one outside a bit of the frame. So, but don't feel obliged to take out any of this. It's just
No,
an
yeah.
ongoing dialogue with you.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I won't take on the last one only simply to say that, to repeat what Haldane said, the reason I focused on this is that I'm not a citizen of the world. I can only criticize my own country. So, but I think there are questions about.
No problem with that.
Yeah. So I think I mean that's the question about is the nation state a historically contingent form? Can we overcome it? To what extent is the Indian national experiment simply mimicking European models? To what extent is departure? That's a very long question, and I agree it's a very profound thing. And on your two specific points, Arjun, China and India. My sense is that you're absolutely right that if my Chinese friends, which I gave a version of this talk. At the University of Toronto, which has some very prominent Chinese intellectuals, at the invitation of Dr. David Malone. And I think the Chinese intellectual chairing the talk, and he said that, we have all this and more. So I think there are various issues of minority rights, of economic inequalities. But I think I'll just take a issue with you on one small thing. I don't think India is even an expert at wealth generation. Because our wealth generation has been so much focused on services and real estate that it's not even been wealth generation, that is employment generation. So the Chinese, at least, has been manufacturing led, so large numbers of people have been absorbed. So in that sense, we're worse off than the Chinese on that narrow aspect. On the Dalit issue, you see, the reason I spoke about tribals, and it's partly because, as you said, that, I wanted 4 rather than 40 problems. My view is that my view is actually somewhat revisionist in this respect. There are two things I'd like to say. One is that, again, as a historian, you see, there's always a tension in when you take on a contemporary policy public issue, tension between the historian speaking and the citizen speaking. As a historian, I would like to make the statement, though it may sound controversial, but I would defend it, that if I would say this that I can't think of a single society that has perfected scripturally, morally, and institutionally the practice of social and religious discrimination in such a sophisticated way as India. And Dalits and women have faced it. However, in the last 60 years, because of the Indian constitution, because of activism, because of electoral reform, Dalits and women have made more progress in the last 60 years than the previous 6,000. The progress is not enough, but still, as a historian, I would like to make this statement. Then I would further want to say that with regard to Dalits particularly, there is a visible, highly capable intelligentsia that articulates the demands, the aspirations of the Dalits. And the Adiva, as a consequence of which, Dalit issues, which are, you're right, are incompletely resolved, are at least discussed and debated in the national press. Adivasi issues are invisible. Every national party has to pay lip service to the Dalits. They had to have a Dalit minister, a Dalit governor, a Dalit president, a Dalit Supreme Court justice. There has not been a single Adivasi since 1947 who has ever got a major cabinet post. So I think that's partly the reason, that there are very complicated reasons for this. Why? I mean, could go back to the fact that the Dalits since we're speaking in New York, and Sweza reminded me the other day about Ambedkar, that the Dalits have had an inspirational all India figure who 65 years after he's dead inspires them to educate, as Ambedkar said, educate and organize. And there are very complicated reasons, there might be geographical reasons and so on. But I think this insufficient attention is paid to the fact that the Adivasi tragedy, the Dalit emancipation is on a slow upward curve. Too slow, too interrupted, but it's an upward curve. Adivasis may actually be doing, even in economic terms, worse than they were 50 years ago. That's really the reason. Yeah.
questions. Dick Stewart.
So, part of your talk you didn't really have a chance to develop was what's it take to be a superpower?
Yeah.
And I think back to India had all these fault lines in the Cold War, but they were a leader of the non-aligned nations, and they were the balance wheel in the Cold War as far as what we now call the developing countries. But they were just as subject to your fault lines then as now. So what does it take to be a superpower, and what role might India play, whether superpower or not? You want them to play more of a role.
I do. I think, as I said, I mean, non-alignment is a good example because, I think, I said alliances with countries like Brazil and South Africa. Those who advocate India playing a more aggressive role, essentially also advocate India entering into a very close alliance with the United States. And, sometimes it's articulated in terms of shared ideals and goals, multicultural democracy. Sometimes it's articulated in terms of shared enemies, the Chinese. We have to come together to keep, to push back the Chinese. But I would say that, non-alignment is an interesting example because I think, and then I might have a minor disagreement with Arjun in that to say that I actually don't believe that, I think there is something peculiar about the Indian national experiment, where particularly its multi-religious and multilingual nature. That is not found in Pakistan. I sometimes say this and my Pakistani friends get angry, but it's true. Pakistan is the perfect European nation. One language, one religion, one enemy. Israel and Pakistan are mirror images of one another in that sense. So I think there is something about nurturing pluralism which makes us more like South Africa, and where they're borrowing and which could be on questions of especially with international migration and so on. I mean, there are ways in which India can play influence debates in Europe on immigration. How to handle the Muslim minority would be a good example. So in that sense, there are other ways in which India could play a more important role. Whether you want to call it a modified non-alignment, updated non-alignment, that's possible. But not in terms of aggressively asserting economic might that does not exist, or a kind of military arrogance. I mean, there's again, Professor Choudhry, we were talking about this the other day. There was a famous statement by a 19th century Mexican president, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States of America. And every Nepali prime minister can say that. Poor Nepal, so far from Vishnu, so close to the Republic of India. And I think that's other ways in which India can reimagine its international relations. Is we've ruined the way we treat, especially relations with Nepal and Bangladesh. So I think there are ways in which, and the idea that a superpower is one who has, but I think, of course, we need to be vigilant. We need to have a good army, a navy, but essentially for defensive purposes. And I think the idea that a superpower is one who expands its economic and military and coercive imprint. That's what I really have problems with. Yeah.
Okay. What's your view on what seems to some of us to be a significant change in the political architecture? We have a lot of state-based local parties.
Yeah.
There seems to be a decline and an absence
Yeah.
of what we might call a national party.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. I think it's again a very complex issue. It's to do with, if you look at the rise of regional and caste-based parties, at one level, they're a manifestation of the deepening of Indian democracy. Because India is too large and too diverse simply to be contained by, two national parties. If you look at, say, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, the Dravidian movement once wanted an independent nation. Now they want to rule their own state. So, it's a kind of deepening of federalism. But when you aggregate this to a national level, you get less than optimal outcomes. You get 15 or 20 party coalitions which can't implement proper policies, which indulge in rent seeking and so on. So it's part, we're still trying to understand, it's because we're a young experiment, a unique experiment, we're still trying to understand these manifestations. Now, what do we do in the future with this? I said, it's a manifestation of democratic deepening, but it also produces bad or counterproductive policies. How do we reimagine this? One way of reimagining it is to really try and cultivate stable two-party systems in the States. One of the finest books I've read on Indian social history is a book by Robin Jeffries on Kerala called Politics, Women and Well-Being, where he argues that the so-called Kerala social miracle, where they have really good education and health systems, is to do with the fact that they have a stable two-party system, which is able to put pressure on the other when out of power to perform in these sectors. Another state that has done very well is Himachal, which also has a stable two-party system. So that's one way of reimagining. And most things are in the control of the states. Education, health, with liberalization, economic development, law and order. So that's one way of thinking through it. Another way of thinking through it is perhaps to think that possibly with the growth of a more cosmopolitan middle class, which is less bounded by religious or caste identities, in 30, 40, 50 years, you could have a different kind of political system. But right now we have to live with this, and we have to live with it, and the best way to live with it is to really focus on better performance in the states, because for the next 20 years you will have coalition governments in the center.
Gary.
So I wondered if you could say something about the foreign policy challenges that
Yeah.
face. Then when you talked about your list of challenges, then you left out, and I think it's just that you were covering so much in so much time that I'd like to invite you to reflect on what external threats have meant for the consolidation of the Indian nation, and whether or not these are really a serious factor. 62 was pretty bad. I'm still sort of embarrassed about Mr. Nixon sending a carrier group into the Bay of Bengal. I think most Americans I don't think know about that, but I think we should feel pretty bad about that. But whether or not these things really matter, whether or not they're a significant part of the story, so I wonder if you could reflect a little on that.
Yeah, I think both China and Pakistan, I think we've forgiven the Americans. So it's good. Sometimes historical amnesia is good. Sometimes it's good that no one remembers what Nixon said or did, right? Because then someone with an older memory could throw something back at us and say, this is what, Nehru, when he lectured you. When Nehru, that famous statement by Dean Acheson, that when he met Nehru, and Nehru lectured to him as if he was a classroom and he was the professor, right? So, so I think, let's leave America out of it for the moment. I think China and Pakistan, they're really two complicated issues. On the 62 war, it's which the 50th anniversary of which falls right now as we speak. It's what is quite interesting, and something that it's really come to my realization only quite recently, is that there's a profound asymmetry in the way in which the 62 war is viewed. In India, it's viewed as massive national humiliation. In China, they don't even think of it as a victory or let alone a great victory. It's not thought of at all. All right. When I wrote India after Gandhi, I had 2 chapters on the India-China war. The several recent histories of modern China have about 3 pages on it. A biography of Nehru will have 100 pages on that war. So that's a curious thing. Why is it? It's just an interesting thing to reflect upon. Why does one country consider it a massive defeat and the other country doesn't consider it a victory? Right? Now, that's the aside. But how does India relate to China? There are 2 schools of thought. One is the ally with America and get even because of 62 kind of thing. The other is a kind of led by the left wing, which is that ally with China against America. So how does one negotiate a way out of this? How does one find a way of the way out of it would be some intellectuals have tried to negotiate a way out of it, which would be to say, look at the ancient, which is kind of a Nehruvian way, to go back. Amartya Sen, who's written about this, in a sense is re-echoing Nehru of the 1950s, to say, we shared Buddhism, Ayurveda, X, Y, Z, and so we have. But I think we have to find a way out of ally with China against America and ally with America against China kind of trap. Pakistan is a much more complicated issue, and Kashmir is an unresolved dispute. I would say that regard to those 3 states I mentioned, Manipur, Nagaland and Kashmir, the Indian constitution cleverly and carefully reimagined and applied can find a way of solving the Manipur and the Nagaland disputes. But the Kashmir dispute is an international dispute. I said some years ago, I told an Indian in an interview, I said, India's case on Kashmir is not constitutionally foolproof. It is an international dispute. And this was reproduced in the Pakistani press as Indian Indian historian says India has no case on Kashmir. Now, Pakistan's case on Kashmir is also not constitutionally foolproof. So now this is a real question. How do you find a way out? It would require something of the sagacity of Ireland and so on. And what does it do to Indian nationalism? When there is a threat perception, when there is more insurgency in Kashmir, then there's a consolidation of a right-wing Hindu nationalism, which is really a version of a right-wing Pakistani nationalism. Is that we are a Hindu nation, they're a Muslim nation, that kind of thing. So there are real challenges that the dispute with Kashmir faces to Indian nationalism, especially when insurgency is on the rise or when the terror attacks as in Mumbai. And I just say one last thing on this, because it's partly to do with I think, again, Indian politicians have been very short-sighted, particularly the kind of poisonous partisanship of the two main parties. In 2003, Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Kashmir in 18 years. And Sonia Gandhi told the local Congress ministers, you can't attend this talk. And he was going as a Prime Minister. And but if the Congress, Manmohan Singh, 5 years later, when he started a dialogue with Musharraf over Kashmir, the BJP started a movement against this, popular movement, and they blockaded the valley. So it's a very complicated thing, and I really, I sometimes say, next to Palestine is the most difficult problem. But China, I think we have to find a way out of this. We have to forge our own independent relations with China, regardless of the Americans.
Okay, I have a long queue. So, Sidhu? Yep.
I actually just wanted to go back to this point you were making of the fissures, the fault lines internally and an external role. And in some ways, if you look historically at other quote-unquote superpowers, I don't like that word as much as you
Yeah.
They've coexisted. They've all had internal fault lines, and yet they've been playing major roles globally.
Right.
And I think the question I'd like to sort of pose and push a little bit is, in the 21st century, is there now an awareness and a connection between the domestic fault lines and the need to play a greater role to address the domestic fault lines to some extent, and vice versa? So in some ways, one informs the other, rather than the two being very disparate.
In India, unfortunately, that's not the case. In India, the case is that domestic fault lines are ignored in order to press a more aggressive posture on the international stage. I mean, I spoke about the media. The attacks on our last two environmental ministers have been the first two environmental ministers who are not corrupt, who in a modest way try to implement the law. And the people who attack them most is the Indian Express newspaper. I'll mention the newspaper, and of course the business press. So I think the idea is you are keeping us backwards. You are not allowing us to progress. So things like a case in the Supreme Court I was part of, which was to do with the vigilante army curbing the Maoists. You raise human rights issues, you raise environmental issues. You are, so I think in India, unfortunately, that's not the case. It's really, the reason to focus on this is, often it's said, anyone who talks about internal fault lines is, really destroying our global ambitions.
Sir, you were waiting.
Yeah, I think that will answer this quick. I think if I understand you, that we need a strong state leadership to face these four challenges and many more which are there. But given the fact that, at least for the foreseeable future, we are going to have coalition governments, which always seek the least common denominator.
Yeah.
So how do you see the situation?
No, it's not. I agree. I mean, the short term, it doesn't look very hopeful. I would say strong. I wouldn't use the word strong. I would, because strong, implies strong, stronger, strongest, and so on. So I think I would rather say a leadership that is focused on implementing the Constitution, on being sensitive to diversity, pluralism, and really that. Yeah.
Let me get back to the theme that you had mentioned about India, maybe partnership with other states in the South, sort of providing lessons to each other, and even to the North, I would say, in terms of managing deep problems such as managing diversity in society. And the boldness of the Indian experiment, as you mentioned, has much to do with trying to encapsulate all of this diversity into the system. So when one comes in with their sort of formal institutional lenses and takes a look at the strategies that were applied, one sees linguistic federalism and one sees reservations. Right? And so the question is, if you are a colleagues were the sort of tour guide for this tour of the Global South, coming to learn about these strategies to manage diversity, which is an issue that, is governments all over the world are facing, and governments that are in Kuwait that are trying to face. Would the title of the tour be, multicultural paradise, institutionalized, or, forest of devil's bargains?
Forest of?
Devil's bargains.
Devil's bargains. Yeah. I'd say I'll offer an alternative. And that comes from Gandhi. It would be called the beauty of compromise. I don't think it's a devil's bargain. I think reservation is not a devil's bargain. I think linguistic pluralism is a great achievement. I mean, my tour would begin with, and I've used this example so many times, people are sick of it, but I'll use it once more. My tour would begin with the Indian rupee note with 17 scripts on it, right? So I would say the beauty of compromise. I mean, that's what it is. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question in a different way? I mean, towards the end of your talk, you talked about what the response should be towards these fault lines. You identified the state, both in terms of its importance and about its incapacity.
Yeah.
But could you talk about the role of other non-state actors, and particularly the corporate sector, the civil society?
Absolutely.
What role do they have and how are they doing?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't mention it because it's overlapped to something I spoke about 2 days ago in my conversation with David Malone. The reason I focus on the state is that that's where the decline has been most precipitous. Civil society is quite active, and I think some would say hyperactive, but as I said 2 days ago, to repeat since you were not there, that in the 50s and 60s, there was a non-existent civil society in India. So it's a clear improvement in the quality of Indian democracy, that you have more civil society organizations doing a variety of work, good and bad, but still. The private sector is much more complicated. I think there are few admirable philanthropists, who particularly in the sector of education, less so health. But by and large, they've really not. That may be true everywhere. That maybe Bill Gates and Warren Buffett may be aberrations even in this country. But the civil society, the decline has been most precipitous in the state. And in a sense, that's really what's worrying, because, of course, you're quite right that the private sector and the civil society must play complementary roles in all of this. I had a wonderful, I must say this, since you're actually, this would interest you. I was once, everyone, but interest you also particularly, but I'll explain why. I was once in a meeting between a remarkable Kashmiri public servant, who is so remarkable that when the government changed, they dismissed him, because that's how partisan Indian governments are. I was once in a conversation, a fly on a wall, between a remarkable Indian public servant and a remarkable Indian industrialist who in many ways is one of the more philanthropically oriented Indian government. And the remarkable public servant was telling the Indian industrialist, please open a unit of your company in Srinagar. The signal it would send, a cutting-edge pharmaceutical company coming, young science graduates. The signal we send to Kashmiris that they want us, they feel they're part of us. The signal we send to Pakistan, and which is of course sunk in a kind of medievalism and further sunk. And of course, the industrialist said, I've run it by my shareholders. The shareholders will say no. So it's a but I think it does. It was for me a very moving, because it was a thing of where the state had failed. But if a private sector had the vision to break this logjam of young Kashmiris not getting dignified employment, what could it do to social tension? But still, it's really in many ways the state which is the principal agency for all of this, and that's where the decline is most marked. So that's why I focused on them. But I completely agree with you. It has to be a much more broad-based approach. Yeah.
You talked at some length about how the Adivasis haven't been brought into the political fold. What do you see as sort of the evolution of this going forward? And in conjunction with that, what is the way out of the Maoist conflict? Both maybe what might be the ideal way out and what you actually see as happening.
Again, is the historian-citizen tension. What's going to happen is that for the next 10 or 15 years, the conflict will continue, low level, and lives will be lost, and so on. And what might happen is that, how will it end? The best way for it to end is for the state to sincerely implement laws that exist in the constitution, the 5th schedule, which allows tribal communities to be stakeholders in mining and forestry projects, for the Maoists to give up arms and enter the democratic process, to follow their comrades in Nepal. But that's not going to happen. So how will it end? Again, it's hard for me to project the future. It won't end happily, but the decline, the violence may decline over a period of 10 or 15 years as the Maoists get exhausted and old and weary, which is rather depressing. But as I said, the imaginative policies the state can do, but the Maoists are also to blame. I mean, they are reckless in the use of violence. And when I went to the kind of heartland of the Maoist violence in Dantewada in 2006, and I met some Maoists, and I posed them, because Prachanda had just come out of, I said, the Nepali Maoists are saying multicultural, they should, they are also, I think there are too many Indian intellectuals who apologize for the Maoists, and they're absolutely brutal and savage. What they've done is undermined, they've escalated the violence in Adivasi areas. So in many ways, they're as culpable as the Indian state.
Dr. Guha, I was hoping you could comment on the proliferation of special economic zones in India, which I know is something you mentioned quite a bit in your commentary.
Yeah.
It seems to me something that cuts across many of the fault lines that you described in the areas, the displacement, impact on Adivasis, and especially the constriction of the role of the state in these zones where environmental regulations are relaxed and a number of other incentives are provided to attract investment with the idea of generating growth and employment. But the impact 7 years on since the fanfare of introduction, I was hoping you could...
Yeah, absolutely. I think they were introduced, again, it would be interesting to do a kind of study of why they were introduced. I think they were introduced through a variety of motives, some malign and some naive or misguided. Either China had done it and that's why they had got 10% growth. Hum bhi karenge, we'll also go. And some, of course, completely malign, that there was clearly one of the people involved in it, and this is one name I can't take because it'll be probably libelous. But clearly one of the people involved in special economic zones was a leading Congress politician who was in charge of raising election funds. And that was also part of it. Obviously, the capitalists had a clear interest in it. They'll get land, it'll be safe, it'll be like walled, they can do what they want, they will get a tax holiday. But why did the political class encourage it? Some of it, as I said, would have been just the idea that, I'd give the Prime Minister himself the benefit of the doubt. He may have thought, that the Chinese are doing it. But some of it was actually, and then of course there was a wave of protests, and it's now stopped. It stopped, and there's talk about a proper, there is a land acquisition policy being discussed, which is of course an overhaul of the 1894 policy. I haven't studied its details very carefully, but I certainly, the people who've drafted it, I think are more sensitive to rural needs than the people who promote special economic zones, and that may be one reason why that policy hasn't been passed yet. But it did lead to several years of bitter conflict. At the moment it's stalled. I think the conflicts have been so intense that there's been a pushback, and which in a sense is good, because now we must really reflect and evaluate, is this really the way to go about
Sir.
China is completely secular in its political realm, and I think that gives it a lot of strength to organize the population. I think religion and politics should be kept as far apart as possible. And India is sort of the leading world model, maybe with Iran, Israel, and America, along with it as theocratic states. And I think we see the toxic effect of bonding your politics and your religious life.
Yeah.
So I think India has something
To learn from China.
to learn from China, and not just a question of siding with the Chinese, but certainly when they set off those rockets, reacting rockets, as some journalist said, oh, we could hit Beijing with those rockets. And I thought, this is the stupidest thing I ever heard.
Absolutely, I would agree.
Authorized by the government.
I think, I don't know enough about the Chinese experiment, but I think what's happened is that Certainly, the first generation of Indian politicians, Nehru above all, was very clear that religion would play no part in defining secularism or in, in state policy. And later, prime ministers have been more equivocal on this. And of course, we are not a theocratic state. We're a secular state, by the way, to correct what you said. We are far from Iran, let alone the United States. But there's a rise, particularly the major opposition party, the BJP, where, which secretly nurtures the ideal of a theocratic state. I mean, they have, that's a worrying thing. But I think, in the spirit of your question, I think a closer interaction with India and China may find, we can learn many things from the Chinese, and maybe the Chinese can learn some things from us. Also, possibly, for example, with regard to treatment of ethnic minorities. I mean, Tibet being a great example, but some others too. And I think that would be the spirit. I think the spirit would be. I think the problem really is that there is virtually no cultural or intellectual interaction between India and China. There is very little of it. Chinese intellectuals come to the West, Indian intellectuals go to the West, but they don't go to each other's countries, and that is really a great shame. Yeah.
Well, we've reached time, and so my final duties are as follows. First of all, I just want to acknowledge and thank a very special friend of NYU and Ram's, and that's David Malone, who is very much responsible for Ram's visit to NYU this week. David is a longtime adjunct faculty member at the law school. He's a distinguished Canadian diplomat, the president of the International Development Research Council in Canada, now president designate of the United Nations University, and he's sitting over there. And he's been very instrumental in arranging for Ram's visit this week, and we're deeply, deeply grateful that this great friend of Ram and a great citizen of NYU would have helped so much. And then finally, please join me in thanking Ram Guha for brilliant remarks today. Thank you.